All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday. We are back. How'd the quiz go on Friday? What's what's that noise?
Not good.
Not good? Okay, that's not encouraging, but okay. Um, let's see who we have here. So Unadi is here. Good morning. Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. Mahmoud is here. Good morning. And Tufshin Sana is here. Good morning to you. All right. So that's not right. This is right. Let's see. Oh, yes. So when we left off on Thursday, I guess it was, we were talking about genocide, right? We had read that section of the textbook that had discussed the Holocaust and Nazi Germany's reasonably successful effort to eradicate Jewish people within Germany, right? And so we know that somewhere between 5 and 7 million Jewish people are killed, as are people of other ethnicities and people with sort of mental and physical disabilities, homosexual people, etc., right? We talked a little bit about what genocide was, and we said that genocide was something that a term that was kind of created at the end of World War II. Sorry guys, I feel like nobody's kind of listening to me over here, Jim and Daniel and Miles. Eyes up here, okay? It was a term that came about at the end of the Second World War, and it was created because of the Holocaust, right? The Allies uncovered these camps, were horrified, and then the UN took some steps to actually describe what this process was and how we should think about it and how we should punish it as well, right? So here we're saying that genocide is basically the attempt to destroy a certain group of people. And again, often when we think of genocide, we think of outright killing people. Sometimes that's what genocide is, but there's other ways that you can go about a genocide as well, right? You can prevent a group from reproducing, so you can sterilize members of the group. You can transfer children out of the group and have them raised by someone else. Or you can somehow create a situation whereby those people cannot continue, right? So you can sort of starve them out, or you can, anything you do to kind of destroy a certain group of people can be seen as genocide. You don't have to kind of outright murder them. And as we can see here, genocides probably don't start with the Holocaust, and they definitely don't end with the Holocaust. And so genocides continue to occur in the modern world as certain groups of people are persecuted and people attempt to drive them out of existence, right? And so sadly, the Holocaust might be one of the more dramatic genocides in the historical record, but again, it's not the only one, and this is not something that is happening in the past. It's something that happens in the present and happens to this very day. We may talk about that a little bit later. On Friday, we read a little article that talked about the 8 stages of genocide, and we said that there were these different phases in which genocides happen, and that you could actually intervene to stop it, right? You can actually do things to stop it before the killing begins. Again, if you pay attention, right? If you know that the process that we go through, right? And so we talked about these questions on Thursday, I believe, that how did these 8 stages manifest in Nazi Germany? And so we talked about classification and symbolization, polarization, organization, the extermination part, but also the denial part, right? The part where after genocides are over, usually the perpetrators will try to cover the evidence or just deny that anything ever happened, right? Whether they just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, we don't know what you're talking about, or whether they say, no, it wasn't a genocide, it was a civil war, that's different. There will usually be attempts to deny that this thing happened in the first place. And that kind of brings us to what we were talking about on, I guess it was Wednesday, right? When we attended the memorial for the children's burials that were found at the Indian residential school in Kamloops, right? So I gave you a little bit of background on the day because we kind of needed it to know what we were talking about, but I'll give you just a little bit more now. Remind me with a quick show of hands, who has heard of Indian residential schools before this class from somewhere else? Yeah. So it's something that we're talking about here in Canada much more than we used to. And again, this is part of the story of Canada, right? And it's part of the story of Indigenous people within Canada and how, those people were pushed aside in order to make room for a white European Canada, which is what we have today, right? And so, as part of that whole process, the Canadian government set up boarding schools across Canada for Indigenous people. And I mentioned again that the schools were something that Indigenous people originally asked for. Indigenous people knew that Canada was changing pretty drastically, right? There was more and more Europeans coming every year. There were cities being built. There were railways. Their sort of traditional way of life seemed to be disappearing. And they knew that their kids would need new skills for the future, right? They knew that their kids would require different skills than the ones that they had. And so they asked the government to provide education for their students, just like the European Canadians were educating their own kids. But again, unfortunately, what the Indigenous people got was not schools like the Europeans had. They got schools that were tools of assimilation, right? And so they were meant to destroy the culture of Indigenous people and kind of mix Indigenous people into Canada in a way that there wouldn't be Indigenous people anymore, right? And so I think we may have heard some of this during the memorial, or I may have told you, but there were hundreds of thousands or 150,000 Indigenous kids attended Indian residential schools across Canada, right? And so I said these schools were in operation for about 100 years. I think the first one opened in 1876 or 1878. The last one closed in 1996, shockingly enough. And again, the schools are kind of infamous for abuse. And so in addition to the roughly 6,000 children that probably died while they were there, although we don't have very good records, so this is a bit of an estimate. We know that there was all kinds of physical and emotional and sexual abuse that happened at the schools. And for the most part, nobody cared, right? People knew about it, or at least people in the government knew about what was going on, and nothing was done, right? And so, again, any sort of misbehavior, regular misbehavior, or particularly misbehavior that had to do with cultural things, like speaking an Indigenous language or doing something, in an Indigenous way, that would get a severe punishment. The schools were meant to kind of break these lines of cultural transmission. And so the schools were hundreds of kilometers away from where these kids lived, so they couldn't go home to their parents on weekends or on holidays or that. If you had a sibling, if you had a brother or student at the same school, they would work hard to separate you so that you would never see them, because they didn't want to reinforce your sort of culture history. They wanted you to learn the European culture. And so these were brutal places, and again, the most vulnerable kids went there and suffered through this, and again, many of them died. And again, keep in mind that in the Kamloops, outside of the Kamloops school where they found these 215 graves, there was no record of those, right? Like, nobody, like, how is it that you can send kids to a school, have them die there, and then Nobody knows anything about it, and there's no record of it, right? That's unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. But again, I'm sure it is not the only one, and I'm sure if and what's going to happen now is people are going to start, using ground sensing or ground penetrating radar to look outside residential schools, and they're going to find more of these. The Kamloops graveyard was not. It's not the only one, right? There are going to be more, and so yeah, it's kind of impossible to overstate how brutal these schools were. And again, they weren't there to educate, right? They were there to assimilate. They were there to make these indigenous kids not indigenous anymore in some way. Okay? And again, many people would accuse what happened at the Indian residential schools, and in addition to all the other things that happened to indigenous people in Canada, as a cultural genocide or just as a straight up genocide. Okay? And that's kind of what I want to explore with you today, right? So, whoops. So again, I want to go back to our critical thinking skills, right? The idea of if somebody's asking us to believe something, we should be able to tell what their argument is, right? We need to know what their conclusion is and what their premises are, the reasons why we should believe what they want us to believe. And so I'm going to skip through these because you've seen them before. I would like you to read this article here, and it's called The Ongoing Legacies of Canadian Genocide. And so again, most people in Canada would say that a genocide has not occurred here, but of course many people, particularly Indigenous people, would. And so this article is going to try to make an argument to us, okay? And what I would like you to do is read the article and then answer the questions at the end. And so let me just pull up this article and remind myself what the questions are here. There it is. Right, so at the end of the article, I'm going to ask you what the argument is, so the conclusion and the premises, the reasons why we should believe this. Why might people want to reject this argument? Why might they want to say, no, you're wrong, okay? What happens if we believe the argument that's being presented to us? And what happens to us if we don't, right? What if we disagree with this? What does the author say that needs to happen to reconcile or to mend the relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people? And finally, do you agree with this? Do you agree with this argument or not? Okay. So let me just see how long this is. Okay. I'm going to put 12 minutes on the clock here, and I'm not sure if that'll be enough, but we'll start with it. I'll put 12 minutes on the clock, and we will read this article, and again, try to figure out what the argument is, right? The conclusion, the main point, what they want us to believe, and then the premises that go along with it, okay? So why should we believe the thing that person wants us to believe? All good? Good? Okay, let's do it. Articles in Microsoft Teams, of course. we doing there, guys? Do you need a little more time, or are you done, or what's happening out there? More time? Maybe what I'll say is I'll give you a little bit more time, but the argument here is not quite as complicated as maybe you think it is. Okay, so it's not a it's not a complex argument that's being made, even though the author says a lot of things, but I think the argument can be summarized quite briefly. But I'll give you a few more minutes, and then maybe we'll try to talk about that. Okay. Okay, let's try and see what we can do with this, okay? Um, so obviously there's some things in this article that go beyond Indian residential schools, right? And again, Canada has, well, as compared to some countries, it doesn't have a very long history. But in this case, we're talking about probably 200 or 300 years of interaction between European Canadians and Indigenous people, right? And so, a lot has happened, right? There's a long history here, and I'm guessing most of you or all of you are not really aware of what that history looks like. And so, again, you're probably reading some of these things, and it's hard to kind of understand them or put them into some sort of context of what they mean. But you can clearly see that some pretty horrendous things have happened in Canada over the past few hundred years, right? And again, they haven't happened consistently. They haven't happened to everybody. They haven't happened for that entire, 200 or 300 year history. But I think we could agree some pretty awful things have happened, yes? Yeah. So let's go to Pamela's argument here. Pamela Palmater is the author. You probably caught this, but just in case you didn't, she is an Indigenous person herself, right? She's talking about our people, her people. So what's the conclusion of this argument? What does Pamela want us to believe? The main thing she wants us to believe. Well, maybe that nothing is going to change, right? What else do you think?
It's up to us to make the change.
Yes, and who is us?
Maybe.
True. Definitely true, right? What else do you think for her main point here?
How it's being swept under the rug.
How what is being?
They're trying to.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? Because we said the last phase of a genocide is denial, right? And we've heard a lot of denial from the Canadian government and from others, right, about what's happened here. You'll notice that she mentions former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper was our Prime Minister before Justin Trudeau. And Stephen Harper says there's no evidence of colonialism in Canada. Ridiculous, right? Canada's a colony of Britain, right? That's how we started our existence, as a colony. There's no history of colonialism in Canada. Ridiculous, right? But again, here we have people stepping in and saying, "Oh no, that's not what's happening here. That's not what we are." Right? Other thoughts about the conclusion of this article. And again, the conclusion doesn't have to come at the conclusion, right? And in fact, she should state it quite soon at the beginning of her article, right? Maybe in the second paragraph or so, maybe in the third. But she should state what she wants us to believe. And I think she does. Let me see. Actually, I think it's right towards the end of the first paragraph, which Pamela is exactly where it should be, to be honest. Right at the end of her introduction. What does she say? She says, "Make no mistake, what happened in Canada fits every category of a genocide." Right? So again, the question about whether what's happened in Canada is or isn't a genocide, Pamela's saying it is, right? Yeah, we should think of it that way. And so why should we think of what's happened to Indigenous people in Canada? Why should we think of that as a genocide? How does she support that idea?
The sterilization.
Yeah.
The women.
Yeah. She
the segregation.
Yeah, she has a list, right? She has a list of kind of 5 with 5 major headings, right? Killing members of the group, serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting living conditions meant to bring about physical destruction, imposing measures to prevent births, forced transfer of children from one group to another. All those things have happened in Canada, right?
Well, she compared it with Hitler as well.
She did. She compared it to Nazi Germany, right? But what does the UN say that genocide is? It says that it's basically all of those things. Yeah. So this is kind of what I meant in terms of it's simpler than you think, because Pamela's argument is saying, look, this is what the UN says that genocide is, right? This is what makes a genocide. And here's a list, right? Canada has done all of these things, right? So therefore, if genocide means doing all of these things, and Canada has done all of those things,
Why isn't anything being done?
yeah, well, yeah, Canada has committed a genocide, and then she goes on to, well, what's going to happen now, right? What should we do? And again, that's the structure of a lot of arguments as well, right? They will say, you know, there's this issue, there's this question, here's my argument. I think this, but then often another step is taken, right? So what do we do about that, right? So if we believe Pamela's argument that a genocide has occurred, well, so what, right? What do we do about that now? And what does she say? What does she say that needs to be done? What needs to happen if we believe this is true?
Sanctions.
What about sanctions?
I feel like we should be imposed, right? Or something, we should do something about it.
Who should do something?
The UN.
The UN. Okay, so the UN might have a role to play here, right?
I mean, I wanted to prevent it, to set up measures like punishment. If it did happen, but nothing's happening right now, so what's going on?
Well, yeah, it's tough to prosecute a genocide when nobody will admit that one has occurred, right? If nobody thinks a genocide has happened, it's hard to punish people for it, right? And I don't know, is she really interested in punishment even?
I don't think so.
No, she doesn't really mention bringing people to justice, but what does she think?
More raising awareness.
Yeah, she wants to raise awareness, right? Why might she want to do that?
Strength in numbers.
Sure, the more people that know about it, I guess that's good.
Yeah. The more people know about it, the more likely someone's bound to do something.
Yeah, right? So the first part of solving a problem is actually acknowledging that the problem exists, right? Again, I've said this before, but you know, if you have a leak in your roof, if you refuse to admit that you have a leak in your roof, you're never going to fix it, right? The first step is saying, hey, the roof is leaking, right? That's the first step, is acknowledging the problem that you have. And Pamela is saying, look, we have a history of genocide in Canada against Indigenous people. And we can't repair that if we don't actually admit that that's what's happened, right? And so, yeah, she's making a strong argument that indeed that has happened. What else needs to be done? What does she say? She has a whole heading there. What's to be done?
Oh, pressure the government.
Yeah, she's asking Indigenous people to set the agenda, right? She's saying that Indigenous people need to organize and say, look, Government of Canada, this is what we want you to do. This is what needs to be done, right? She says we can't sit around and wait for Justin Trudeau to, you know, make good on his promises, which we should note he really has not, right? So is this article from 2016? Is that when it was? March 3rd, yeah. So Justin Trudeau had just been elected I don't know, 6 months ago when this article was published. And so Justin Trudeau campaigned on a lot of things to do with Indigenous people. He was going to establish a nation-to-nation relationship. He was going to implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. He has not really done that. Very recently, I don't know if it passed, but he was trying to pass a law saying that in the future, governments had to make laws in accordance with this Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. But what that means, nobody knows. He just kind of passed it, and I feel like it's so that when he goes to the next election, he can say, "Oh, look, I did that," right? But the law, nobody knows how the law works or if it'll do anything. But yeah, Pamela is saying we can't wait for the Prime Minister, right? We have to set the agenda ourselves. We have to tell the government this is what's needed, this is what has to be done, and then pressure them to move, right? Pressure them to move on it. And part of that is getting the Canadian public on board. And that's part of what this article does, right? Is it tries to convince people that, hey, something horrible has happened here and continues to happen. And it needs to be fixed, right? It needs to be repaired. Maybe I'll just ask you this question here. Why might people want to reject? Well, actually, before we get to that, let's analyze this argument here. So this is Pamela's argument right here, right? That we should understand what's happened to Indigenous people as a genocide, right? And why? Because this is how the UN defines a genocide. And the second premise, Canada has done all of those things, right? Canada's checked those boxes. So is this a logically sound argument? How do we figure that out again? We check to see if the premises, what? Makes sense? What are the words I usually use for that? Yeah, they're logically sound. Are they logical support for the conclusion? And then the second part is, are they true, right? So here we have Canada's treatment of Indigenous people has been understood as genocide. So the first premise is this is what genocide is. Is that true? That first premise? It's true, right? That's what the UN actually said. Is that support for what happened to Canada's Indigenous people? Well, it depends, right? It depends on the second premise, right? It depends on the second premise. And the second premise is that the Canadian government has actually done these things. So that's logical support, right? Because they've done the things that are considered genocide. And are those things true? Well, you might not have enough background in Canadian history to know, but yeah, those things are all true. So they have happened. Again, they didn't happen to every Indigenous person. They didn't happen through the entire history of Canada. They didn't all happen at the same time. They didn't all happen in an organized fashion, but at one time or another, all of those things have occurred to Indigenous people in Canada, and some of them continue to happen. So, do we have a logically sound argument here? I would say so, right? Again, it's not a complicated one, right? We just simply agree on the definition of genocide, and if Canada has done all those things, then that's what it is. Well, why might someone reject this argument if it is logically sound?
Denial.
What do you mean denial?
They would reject it if they had denial. If they refuse to acknowledge that this is happening.
Why would they refuse to acknowledge these things?
extracurricular activity.
Maybe. No, we like to go to the Gap.
Get offended for other people.
Yeah, get offended. But yeah, why would someone want to deny this though? For real, why would someone want to deny this? Especially if it's a logical argument, which it is.
I mean, the government will definitely deny it, like to maintain a good image.
Right? The government might want to deny it because it might make them look bad, right? Although I would argue that denying it makes them look bad, but that's okay. Why else?
Avoid the sanction, avoid the punishment.
Right? The government might be afraid of, well, the government would, they'd have to like punish themselves. It would be weird. I don't know that anyone's going to get punished for what's happened, right? Most of the things that happened in the past, the people are all dead, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, for instance, there are apparently 215 graves of children unmarked. All the people who worked there are dead, right? There's nobody left to punish. And so, yeah, it's not so much a punishment thing in this case, but it's, yeah, what is it? Why might people not want to?
Like, it's in the past, it's not their problem.
Well, and that's the thing. Who is it not their problem? Right? It's people like me who it's not their problem, or at least people like me might think that it's not their problem, right? And again, this is not a social justice class, but if it were, I would say that's the definition of privilege right there, right? Privilege is that you get to ignore it, right? And so non-Indigenous people can choose to ignore this if they want, right? But for Indigenous people, the discovery of those graves hits pretty close to home, right? Remember in the memorial on Wednesday, we were, what was her name? Should have written it down. There was an Indigenous person, this woman who spoke, and she said that she had been to Indian residential schools, as had her siblings, her 5 or 6 siblings, and her parents had gone to Indian residential school as well. Do you think the discovery of 215 graves outside an Indian residential school, do you think that hits pretty close to home for them? Yeah. Do you think they could ignore that? Probably not, right? And so again, privilege is the ability to ignore it. But lots of people probably did, and lots of people are able to, right? Because again, if it doesn't impact you, you don't have to think about it very much, right? But again, you can't solve these issues unless you admit that they exist, right? And again, nobody's looking to punish anyone else, I don't think. And again, lots of the people who perpetrated these things are dead. I mean, look at this one here. Where's the quote? Here. This is on page 2. There's a quote. Indian children, this is Duncan Campbell Scott. Duncan Campbell Scott was the Minister of Indian Affairs in the very late 1800s. So this is the guy in charge of the government department that deals with Indigenous people. He says, Indian children die at a much higher rate in residential schools than in their village. But this alone does not justify a change in policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Right? First of all, kids dying at your school, like if that's not a reason to change your policy, like what is? Right? Unbelievable. And then he goes on to say, not only does it not change the policy of the department, but the department is geared toward a final solution of our Indian problem. What does that sound like? That sounds like something that who would say? Yeah, right? If you swap out Indian with Jew or Jewish, you've got exactly the same thing, right? That's what he said. He was looking for a final solution to this Jewish question or Jewish problem. And so Yeah, like shocking stuff, right? And coming directly from the Canadian government in the late 1800s. Okay, let's take a little break here because I think we need one. Take a break, come back, and we'll tie this up, okay? Okay, and we're back. So, so I asked you to read this article here, and we came up with the argument, and again, it's a very simple one, right? This is what Pamela's argument is that Canada has committed a genocide here because this is what the UN has defined as a genocide, and again, Canada has done a bunch of those things. Again, it's a different genocide than we see in Nazi Germany, right? But Pamela tries to, I think, answer people's concerns, right? And she does that at the beginning, right? She says that, does it matter if you intend to commit a genocide or not? What does she say? Does it matter if you mean to commit one or not?
No.
No, right? So intent doesn't really matter, right? If you destroy a group of people, that's a genocide, whether you were meaning to or not. What about the number of people? How many people do you need to kill in order for it to be a genocide? Yeah, well, she says there's no certain amount of people that need to die as a benchmark, right? So it's not dependent on how many people die. What does she say about time period, right? It doesn't need to happen in a compressed time period either, right? So she's trying to answer people's criticisms and say, look, you may think of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany where millions of Jewish people died within a span of a few years, and it was a very organized system of extermination, right? But that's not really what happened in Canada, right? It wasn't that organized, it wasn't systematic, and it's occurred over a very long time span. But she says, make no mistake, those genocidal actions have happened. Why might people want to reject the argument? Well, Ben suggested that maybe there's some fear of punishment or reprisal, right? Sort of non-Indigenous Canadians or European Canadians might just not be that interested in it, right? And again, that's privilege, right? They're able to ignore this whole situation and carry on with their lives, right? For Indigenous people, much more difficult, right?
It might also mean that they finally have to accept the Aboriginal.
Yeah, it might actually mean that, so I guess, yeah, so the consequences of believing this argument are that, we might finally have to do something about it, right? And that's kind of what I had here. Sorry, just let me go to that. Yeah, that's kind of what I had here, is that, sorry. Yeah, that if you believe this argument, then you actually have to do something about it, right? Unless you're okay with genocide, right? I'm going to assume everyone here is not okay with genocide. If you are, I would just keep it to yourself, I think. But
I know someone who is.
well, I'm going to assume that almost everyone is I can put you down for no, right? Most people I think I can put down for no. So, yeah, but if you believe this has happened, then you kind of have to do something about it, right? Because, we don't want to allow genocides to continue, and we don't want to allow them to go unrepaired, right? But again, if you don't believe this argument, or if you don't want to agree with her, well, then things kind of stay the same, right? And Indigenous people continue to suffer in Canada. The other thing maybe we should mention too is the rejection of this argument. So one of the things that didn't come up is maybe the weight of that word, right? Genocide's a pretty heavy word, right? Yeah, you don't just throw around the word genocide, right? It is a heavy term with it's got lots of weight, right? It's got lots of negative feeling about it. And so, yeah, it's something significant to admit that your country has perpetrated a genocide against people, right? That's not a fun thing to admit, right? It's not an easy thing to admit. And so even though Pamela is making a good argument here, I think, I could see people wanting to dismiss it, What do you think? Do you agree with her? Do you disagree? Do you feel like do you not know enough to agree or disagree? Everyone's going to look at their screens, but I promise you I will not disappear. When you look up, I will still be here. So
I don't know how to feel about it.
you don't know? Why not?
Because I'm not like one of them. But
You
generally it doesn't apply to me. So I can still keep on going with it.
True. So there's a privilege element, right? And also you're kind of new here, right? So yeah, so this isn't your experience, right? This isn't something that's directly affecting you. How else do you feel about this? Agree, disagree? Is she being really dramatic? Is she not being dramatic enough?
She's doing but I honestly don't think I can't think of anything the government can do to increase anything.
Well, that depends, right? And that depends if you think about the past or the present.
I mean like acknowledgement is what they want. And if the government acknowledges them, what's gonna happen then? What can they do?
Well, about the past, I would say very little.
Yeah, but
Right.
about the future, I don't think do they still have like their school?
The schools don't exist anymore,
Yeah.
but indigenous communities still have poor education outcomes, health outcomes. They still live a lower quality of life. They still earn less money. They still suffer racism and discrimination. There's a lot of mental health issues to deal with. And that's the problem, is that something like this, you can't take generations of people and submit them to torture and then expect everything to be okay, right? These are incredibly traumatic things that happened, and basically what the government did was destroy not so much the culture of, well, to some degree they destroyed the culture, but they destroyed families, right? They destroyed communities. They took these people and dehumanized them and stripped away part of their humanity, right? Some people might say, they stole their soul or whatever. You could phrase it a bunch of different ways. But you don't just get over that in a week, right? When you have generations of people who have been traumatized, right, and deeply, deeply hurt. What do people do? How do people try to soothe themselves when they're traumatized to that degree?
Therapy.
Yeah, if you can afford it.
Drugs. It's normal for me.
Yeah, people often medicate themselves, right? So sometimes they'll smoke stuff, right? Whether it's tobacco or vaping or marijuana. Sometimes they'll drink stuff like alcohol. Sometimes they'll move on to harder stuff, right? Harder drugs if the softer ones don't work. And so, yeah, people who have suffered intense trauma often try to medicate themselves with drugs or alcohol, right? And so, yeah, there's many indigenous communities have problems with this because, again, there's generational trauma, right? These people have been brutalized for hundreds of years, right? And how do you fix that especially when nobody cares, right? When Canadians don't seem to give a shit one way or the other, when there's no support for you, when all of your programs are underfunded, when a lot of your communities don't even have clean drinking water. They have to boil. There's a lot of indigenous communities that have to boil their water because they don't have proper water treatment because the government hasn't installed proper water filtration.
Oh, it's free.
Huh?
The water filtration
Well, yeah, like when you turn on the tap at home, clean water comes out. But a lot of indigenous communities don't have that. So they live outside of the city, there's no water filtration, and so they have to boil all their own water. Same thing with power and internet. Their power and internet is not as, the infrastructure is poor, so they don't have those kinds of things either in some cases. But yeah, that takes a long time to heal, and it especially takes a long time to heal when nobody, when nobody cares what's happening, right? And so, yeah, it's one that, it's a problem that doesn't get better when people don't at least acknowledge it, right? And so, again, how does it feel to know that, your people, this was your people's home, right? And then 100 years ago or so, you were pushed aside, you were traumatized and brutalized, and then the Prime Minister of Canada says, oh, we have no history of colonialism in Canada, right? We have a disproportionate number of Indigenous women disappearing or being murdered, right? And so people say to Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister, hey, are you going to look into this? And he says, no, it's not high on our radar, really, right? How does that feel? It's what? Yeah, right? It's a shrug of the shoulders, right? It's like, yeah, whatever. You guys suffered in the past, you're suffering now, whatever, right? Doesn't feel very good either. And it certainly doesn't solve, it certainly doesn't mend the relationship, right? So, and that's kind of what this article is about, I think, is legacy, right? How do you, when something has gone totally wrong in the past, how do you fix it in the present, right? And Ben, you mentioned a little bit earlier that, well, like, what can you do, right? The past is the past. You can't undo it, right? You can't go back in time and change it. But how you deal with the past in the present is an important thing. And that's actually what I'd like to talk about right now. So, yeah, this is some of the questions here that I think are maybe floating around. So, what is the purpose of classifying something as a genocide, even when it happened years ago, right? Ben, you mentioned this as well, like the idea of punishment and justice, right? How can you achieve justice in any way for things that have happened in the past, right? How can a country heal from this, especially if the people are all dead, right? Or maybe the question is more complicated if the people are all alive, as they are in Rwanda, right? And how do we remember the past, right? How do we think about what's happened and deal with it in the present, okay? So let me show you this. I have a short video to show you here, and it's about a bell. And it has to do with, it's a bell in Germany, I'll show you in a second. And it has to do with this very question of how do you deal with the past, especially when something like a genocide has occurred, okay? How do you think about the past? How do you remember it, right? What do you do with things that are from the past, either primary sources or artifacts, right? Objects that come from the past. And what does a country tell itself about its history, right? So here in Canada, for a long time, the history we told ourselves was that we were a great country and, people came here, white Europeans came here and traded with the indigenous people and then built this great nation, and isn't it fantastic, right? But again, we skipped over all of the things that happened to indigenous people. At the moment, we are reimagining that history. We're trying to figure out, what story do we tell ourselves about what Canada is and where it comes from. Some people are even calling for Canada Day to be canceled this year. Have you read about that or heard about that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
same thing that happened to Australia a few years back. And it's still going on now.
Yeah, Australia has a colonial history and a
Not the same thing.
mistreatment of Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how to compare them, but yeah, they had a similar situation with Australian Aborigines, right? Who again were pushed aside
Yeah.
to create Australia.
Now in Australia, there's always a protest.
What's that?
There's always a protest
Yeah.
for Australia Day, and they managed to move the date.
Yeah. But yeah. And so yeah, we're having the same thing here now, right? Is that should Canada Day be canceled, or what should we be doing on that date, right? Should we be celebrating Canada? Should we be mourning the loss of Indigenous people? Should we just forget about the whole thing? How do we commemorate the past, right? How do we choose to remember it? What story do we tell ourselves? Okay, so for online people, there's the video link and the questions are in Microsoft Teams. We're going to watch this video quickly and then we'll come back and answer the questions that we have time to answer, okay? So online people, go to Microsoft Teams and we'll see you back here in just a little bit, okay?